So on March 20th, 2020, we were supposed to have a live symposium entitled ADR's Place in Navigating a Polarized Era. It is now November, and I think we still are in a polarized era. And the question about ADR's place in navigating it, I think, is still a relevant question. Because we weren't able to do the live symposium, we are instead having conversations with our various symposium authors. And one of those is Jill DeTemple. She's the chair of religious studies, professor of religious studies, and has a courtesy appointment as associate professor of anthropology at Southern Methodist University. She also recently won the American Academy of Religion Award for teaching excellence. Her research focuses on religiously sponsored development in Latin America, and also on the uses of dialogue for teaching in higher education. And regarding that second focus area, she's working right now on an edited volume that introduces reflective structured dialogue and attendant approaches to dialogic classrooms in post-secondary contexts. With John Saruf, who's the director of Essential Partners, she's written an article entitled Disruption, Dialogue, and Swerve, Reflective Structured Dialogue in Religious Studies Classrooms. And for our symposium, she's written an article entitled The Spaces We Make, Dialogic Classrooms and Social Transformation. After Jill has an initial opportunity to tell us about her article, then Peter Riley and I will engage in a conversation with Jill. Peter is the Associate Director of the Dispute Resolution Program at Texas A&M University School of Law, as well as being a professor of law here, who has written quite a lot regarding negotiation and also dispute resolution in the context of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And with that, I am going to turn this over to you, Jill.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today and for that earlier symposium that feels so long ago, back in March. This is fabulous, and I'm really glad to be here. So my job right now is to give an overview of that article and some things we talked about back in March. And the article starts with a story, which I think is actually the best place to start today. And the story was about the day I walked into this brand new classroom we had on the SMU campus. It had been finished literally the day before, and I was very excited to be in something newer than the classrooms that I have in my building normally, which is on the historic register. Like, we're in a pretty old building here, at least old for Texas. But when I walked in there, the classroom itself was in this sort of weird L shape, so that either students would have to face one wall that had a whiteboard on it, or another wall where the podium was and where anything projected would be. And right away, it became clear that they couldn't do both at the same time. And they were very confused in that space. They couldn't face each other. We actually couldn't move the furniture around in there very well. And I couldn't see beyond that classroom space out into this little foyer where it turns out half of my students had been locked out. And it really got me thinking about pedagogical spaces, that classroom from hell that I was in. That the spaces we make really matter in a classroom. It really matters for what people can do together in a classroom. And that what we can do together matters for what people can learn, and then how they can take that away. So that was the starting piece for this article, because something I've been involved in since that awful day with that classroom from hell has been looking at reflective structured dialogue as a way of teaching and learning in those same undergraduate classrooms. So what that is, reflective structured dialogue is a mode of teaching and listening across difference that was pioneered by an organization that is now called Essential Partners in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The founders of that organization had noticed some really public, awful rhetoric around abortion clinic violence that had just happened in Boston in 1989. They were family therapists, and what they noticed in that rhetoric, with people talking over each other and threatening violence and not listening, was that it looked a lot like dysfunctional family rhetoric, the things they were seeing in their practices. And so in a series of events, they brought people from both sides of the abortion debate together, not so that they would agree, but so they would learn to listen to each other and rehumanize each other. And when that went well, they founded a nonprofit that now does this work all over the world. So what it is, it gets abbreviated as RSD, so you don't have to say reflective structured dialogue all the time because that's a mouthful, is put an emphasis on all of those things so that people are able to speak to be understood and listen to understand other people. So when in one of these processes, we give people that time to reflect, especially when we feel like we might be attacked by the other side of some issue. Our first reaction may not be our best reaction, but if we give people that time to reflect, a minute or even two, you may get to your best reaction, the one that's really there, really deep, right? One that is reflective as opposed to reactive. It is structured. We want to make sure that everybody is able to speak and to listen carefully. And so in dialogue circles, we have a timer on everyone. Everyone gets the same amount of time to speak and to listen, usually about 2 minutes. And after those initial rounds have gone, we usually ask people to tell a story that would help us understand how they came to a position about something. And then we ask them to dig deeper into that, ask about their values, what's underneath that for you, what's at the heart of the matter, and then ask people where they feel pulled. Really dig into that complexity. Because that's where you realize that the conversations we're usually seeing, especially right now in a polarized public, those are conversations you don't even have to have another person for. You probably know both sides of that issue. But if you listen to the way most people are engaging with those issues, most of us do have complexity there. Even if we're pretty strongly on one side of abortion or guns or immigration, we may have moments where we say, but I kind of realize this may not be true all the time for all people or even for me. And that's where the connections can happen, those moments. I got really interested in bringing this into classrooms because my students, again, they have not had great role models for all of this for those reasons of the public rhetoric around these issues. They're afraid. My students in religious studies have actually been told not to speak about religion. So I've been spending a lot of time, or politics, it all goes together. And I happen to teach about religion and politics as they come together. So you can imagine what I'm up against. And as I learned about reflective structured dialogue, I realized that this could be really useful for my students. And then we also have a graduate program here at SMU. And I wanted to teach my graduate students how to do this so they wouldn't have to go through this process of learning how to teach undergraduates as they move on in their careers. I got very lucky with this as well. There turns out to be a lot of people around the country interested in using reflective structured dialogue to better undergraduate education. And John Saruf at Essential Partners put together a team of us. We were able to train a lot of faculty around the country, 5 different institutions, in the method and then track their students. And what we found out is that it's really good for student engagement, for their sense of belonging, for their sense of resilience in listening to things that are hard to hear. And as it turns out, it's excellent teaching. Students were learning better in the classes where we used this. And that's what I talk about in the article, is making that space, how we make that space. You have to structure it for a purpose. You have communication agreements. You voice the values that are behind reflective structured dialogue. You voice values of listening with resilience, of not interrupting, of asking great, curious questions. Curiosity is a value we uphold in this work. We recenter the engagement of the course from being all centered on me as a teacher to being centered around those curious ideas, to the point where students then can hold their own space and ask curious questions of each other. And I can just get out of the way. And this is, I think, what makes them really interested in whatever the course content is. I got to be a huge fan when a couple of sorority women reported to me that they'd been talking about analytic philosophy over a chapter dinner in late April. Most people have given up reading by late April at all, never mind the stuff that involves math, as analytic philosophy does, never mind sharing it with students who aren't even in this class. They had just gotten interested in a way I had never been able to sort of pull out of them in previous incarnations of the course. So then I finished the article by talking about what happened when I shifted the space in that same way by using dialogic techniques in a graduate class. Because a conversation I'd had reminded me that what we often do to graduate students is what we do in political polarization. We flatten them out. So one thing that can happen in polarized societies is when somebody has a stand, we forget, you have a sort of triggered reaction to that. When you're triggered because of a potential threat, you don't see complexity. You're just focused on the threat. And so your neighbor, who you may have realized before, like brought you flowers when you were sick, or took in your newspaper, or took care of your pets, or is on the PTA and plays the cello and makes a great latte, simply becomes Joe the Democrat if that's threatening for you. And you forget all of those other things. And we do the same thing to graduate students. We reduce them in their identities to their project, to their advisor, to their academic commitments. And I had seen what happens with this in a really polarized seminar where people were crying a few years ago. They were so divided, we just couldn't move along. Nobody would take an intellectual risk. They were not doing as well on exercises that I used regularly in a similar class with my undergraduates. They couldn't have any fun with the material in order to learn it. And it was a miserable space. So when I had that epiphany that one reason it was miserable was the polarization, I decided to make a graduate course dialogic and to have them do some things very differently. I reoriented the core material such that it wasn't about mastering the core material, it was orienting to it. I have this huge image of a glacier on the front cover of the syllabus and said, the history of religious studies is that glacier, and you're going to have to decide if you're going to stand in that path and shout it to the rooftops or to the moon or wherever, or if you're going to want to do something different, if you're going to reify it or reject it. Maybe you don't want any part of that history. You're going to get out of the path of that glacier, or if you're going to take pieces of it and do something new with it. But that's what you're in this class to do, is figure out how you orient to it. And to do that, we're also going to have to orient to each other in the space of the classroom. And so I used all of these same dialogic techniques. And I'm going to tell you, it felt very risky. But at the end of the day, my students knew that material, I think, better than they usually do. They were not entrenched on opposite sides of our particular divides that happen in the field of religious studies. They were speaking across them. They had deeply humanized each other. Amongst other things, I was using some improv theater techniques at the beginning of every day to remind them that they are people first. And one of the core principles in reflective structured dialogue is people before process and connection before content. And so we did a lot of work just relentlessly connecting people. And at the end of the day, that class was joyous. We often ran over time because we were just happy to be with each other. And again, they produced some very good final papers. So I come to the end of this paper, just to wrap up real quickly, by recommending we really think about these spaces that we're holding in academic contexts, and then imagining what would happen if we trained people who could hold those spaces and then move along into other classrooms or into other work publicly. Realizing that this isn't dispute resolution. We were never coming to consensus. I think one reason that graduate class worked is I did not ask them to come to consensus. I asked them to have a genuine conversation with each other about what they wanted to be, who they wanted to be, how they wanted to be in relationship to material that they understood very deeply. And that, I think, has real potential as they go out and teach, as they go out and research, as they handle other historic texts. And so that's where I sort of hang my hopes on this, is that students will be able to create other spaces, again, be they in the academy or beyond. I currently have a former graduate student working in the historical office of Iowa who has used these techniques to very good effect and has written me to say that they've been very helpful in a lot of the work that he's doing as a public historian, because he's been able to shift the conversation to something much more productive. So that's where I make the case where this is a form of something we might recognize not exactly as dispute resolution, but as something that has a family resemblance to it, and something that could be very useful in a polarized public. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We're so glad you were part of this symposium.
Well, thank you. It feels great to pretend to be a law person.
So Peter, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Sure, I'd be glad to, and thank you for that overview. That was great. And I have to say, I want to emphasize Nancy's comment that we were so delighted to have you a part of this conference. I wrote and I heard you on when you were interviewed by KERA, which is our local NPR affiliate. And I, of course, immediately shot an email to Nancy and I said, we have to talk to this person. And she wrote right back and she said, she's already on my list. So from the get-go, I think that we immediately saw how much what you're doing resonates with dispute resolution. And I absolutely agree that it also probably profoundly can impact people, all different kinds of work that people are going off in the world to do. But it definitely speaks to dispute resolution. I mean, when you're talking about, you know, connections and belonging, resilience, openness, good questions, no interrupting. I mean, it's practically a syllabus for a negotiations class. But I guess that I want to open up a topic that it's sort of a theme that runs through your writing in this paper, and that is the concept of risk. And to engage in what you're talking about, it's risky for professors and it's risky for students. There are not a lot of professors I know who want to get out of the way. There are not a lot of professors I know who want to do acting exercises at the beginning of class, which I would certainly do because I love that stuff and I understand how it can connect people and open them up to receiving other really important information that I want to give them. But I'm wondering if maybe we could have a little bit of conversation about just the risk that is involved for somebody to do this kind of engagement for both the professors and the students.
Peter, I'm so glad you asked about that because risk is an element. And risk as vulnerability, I think, is how I would actually put a finer point on that. We are asking people to tell stories about their lives, which can feel very risky. One thing we do to mitigate some of that risk is to give people the option to pass or pass for now. That is always an option so that people have agency not only over what they say, but their own ability and timing about when they say it. But to your bigger point about professors feeling this is risky, I think that's exactly right. As we've trained faculty around the country in this and done a lot of workshops, people will often come to us and say, but this just feels so different, so scary. And it is. I did a gun dialogue in 2017, I think it was. And I was shaking when I went into that classroom. My students had assured me they were ready for it, but it felt so absolutely terrifying. And I'd been teaching at that point for 17 years. And it just took a lot of practice to get more comfortable. And what we tell people is, first of all, you shouldn't start teaching like somebody else. You should take this, all of these approaches that we're giving you, that we're calling a dialogic classroom, and you should be you. You need to teach like you. Don't try to be me or my colleague Betsy or any of these other fabulous teachers that we have working on this project together. You have to be you and then figure out how this works with you in a classroom, because that will make it feel less risky. But it will feel weird. And we also talk about the feelings of weirdness that will come. I always knew the day would come, and it did last year when somebody opened up the door of my classroom, saw me hiding behind the computer monitor, and all of my students engaged in dialogue circles. They were being a little bit loud for the class next door. And I realized that it looks like I'm doing nothing. This guy thinks I'm doing nothing. And I'm like checking my phone back here, even though I am facilitating from the front of a room. And it felt a little strange, except that I'm also hoping he saw that my students were deeply engaged with each other in that moment. The reason they were a little bit loud is they were all leaned in, having the end part of that dialogue where they were asking curious questions to one another. So I think there are a few things. What we learned about dialogic classrooms is they have to be scaffolded. I'm not going to move students into a conversation about guns on the second day of the semester. That happens at the end. We have done a lot of work getting them ready to have these conversations. We talk about what good listening is. We talk about how to listen with resilience. We do a lot of practicing about these things. We've done other dialogues. We've done a lot of dialogic moments. until it becomes the native culture of the course. And then it's not so risky, and they know how to control themselves in the space. And I don't feel like I'm going to die, so I'm not projecting that anxiety out into the room in the way I would be with a group of people I don't know. I will say it's been harder in the age of COVID. Doing this on Zoom is more difficult because we can't do it in a classroom. It would be risky. Even with masks, I can't put people in close circles. But my students are doing great with this semester. They have learned to trust each other and to dig pretty deeply in some instances. We've been doing a series of dialogues around the election, and students, even at the secondary level, are doing this and doing it well. So I find that the hope of having genuine conversation and people's joy in having just had a genuine conversation about something like the election outweighs that sense of risk and vulnerability if it's scaffolded well.
You brought up something in the paper about, some students saying they had this sort of fear of, oh, this is so different. Maybe it won't help me as much as, the other section who's covering it in the traditional way, or I might be behind on my final exams, or what, can you speak to that and how a professor who's interested in doing this can maybe tamp down those fears that the students have?
So I think one thing that comes up is our sense that it would somehow compete with content. That if we're doing dialogue, it's competing with the core content of a course. What that research study that we did shows is that it's quite the opposite. That again, if the course is well scaffolded and if students know why they're having the dialogue, they will better remember and be able to further advance that course content. My favorite example of this is I teach it's called Social Scientific Approaches to the Study of Religion, upper level course for undergraduates. And in that, it's a completely theoretical course covering the history of awful theories in religion. And we talk about a French theorist who came up with a theory of religious violence. His name is René Girard. It's a mimetic theory, most of which you wouldn't remember tomorrow if I asked you. But what we do is we read that theory. I make sure they have a pretty good grasp of what he was saying, and then we move into that gun dialogue. And what was happening on the surveys, we did that during that greater survey process. And when my students filled out that survey, weeks later, they were spelling René Girard's name correctly. They nailed that theory, and they could link it up directly to the conversation they had had about guns. There was something about that conversation that cemented that theory in their minds for life. Because if you know it's 6 weeks later, as you're trying to pass your organic chemistry exam, you've got it in a way that I had never experienced. And I've been teaching this course forever. So the notion that content competes with this process, I think, is misconceived. You do have to do some work, though. The really successful professors, again, in that study, were the ones who told students why we're doing it. Right, so their students were really well aware of how that dialogue experience hooked up to that core course content, no matter what the field. Maybe it was a stem cell science course in the case of one of my colleagues, or for somebody else, it was a class on philosophy. Those students could articulate not only what happened in the dialogue, but exactly how it hooked up to course content. And they were the most likely to say that those dialogues really helped them understand lectures, readings, and the general stuff of the course.
So I also want to talk with you a little bit about the use of a reflective structured dialogue in the classroom. And then I also want to ask a question about its use outside the classroom. So first, the question of inside the classroom. So in some ways, feel free to disagree with me. In some ways, I imagine that a classroom is an ideal place to be using this if one imagines that what one is trying to do in the classroom is learn and explore. And if one imagines that in the classroom there is some sort of meaningful relationship between professor and student and among the students. So there are ways in which the environment of a classroom has a certain synergy with reflective structured dialogue, potentially at least. But here's my first question, and this is about the classroom. So one of the, in light of the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the protests that followed, we've had some discussions here as faculty about the whether to include racial justice issues in our classes. But, that includes classes like contracts and torts and classes that you tend to think of as being sort of neutral, not necessarily having a political dynamic. There are plenty of critical legal theorists who would say, no area of law does not have a political side to it, right? But still, so as you've had these conversations, have you also had discussions regarding racial justice, racial issues? And if yes, what kinds of advice might you have for people like Peter and me, both in terms of what worked and also what didn't work? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one thing we've learned is it's sometimes better not to go, especially with race, because it's such a complex issue. Race touches almost every aspect of our society, right? Which is one thing we learned, I think, over the summer. And so one way we talk about getting to race is, first of all, understand what the conversation is that you want to have. I think where I had a race dialogue go pretty flat in a class, I don't think I knew what I wanted to do with it. I wanted them to talk about it, but I couldn't quite get at why. And so the question I posed wasn't particularly helpful for them. Where I've done better has been when I've backed it up and just asked people to talk about a time when they were misrepresented in whatever context. Because oftentimes when we're talking about the kind of racial issues that might come up on our campus, for example, or the places where my students want to intersect with that conversation around George Floyd, it's because they feel and are talking about people not being well represented in society. There's an injustice there, but the injustice tends to come down to stereotyping, misrepresentation. Right? That's why people get followed around in stores, or why they're more likely, perhaps, to be on the wrong end of a police encounter. And so I asked them to back it up to that level, to find their own places where maybe they could talk about a time they've been misrepresented, because that's also something everybody can talk about. It's one of the issues. We have a predominantly white campus here at SMU, and a lot of my students haven't thought about themselves as racialized. And so diving straight into where does your race matter doesn't give them easy access. But if I can ask them about a time you've been misrepresented, what was that like? How did you respond? What do you want people to know? That's when we can start having those more difficult conversations, because a lot of things come into the room and start mixing together that hadn't been there and forwarded before. Another thing we'll ask people about is a stereotype that might apply to them. And ask, so if you've been stereotyped in that way, what do you want people to know about that part of your identity that you don't think gets represented in those stereotypical encounters? Right, so that's something where my sorority women might talk about the way they are often perceived. Or I remember clearly a student talking about having been stereotyped as a cheerleader, misrepresented as a cheerleader in some incident in her high school. Which seems, sort of trivial, but for her, it was a really important moment. And actually some kind of bad stuff happened as a result of it. But it also then lets other things systematically come out that may not come out in normal classroom conversations. A student whose mosque was surrounded by people with torches a few years ago. And he was allowed to talk about that feeling of, they don't know us. I wish we tried to invite them into the mosque, but they wouldn't want to come in. And it was this really strange encounter, aside from the torches. It opened up ideas about how we would respond. And that for my students was really empowering. I think the other thing about racial disparity and what I hear from students is they feel completely disempowered in that conversation. They feel like it's been going on forever, and they don't have any agency or voice. And one thing I've done around those sorts of incidents is actually invite them to think about where they have power. I give them in the days where we were in a class together, I gave them a literal 3x5 card and asked them to think about one thing they can do to respond to incidents like that. And then on the other side, one thing they will do. And I actually thought that exercise fell flat, but students are still reaching out to me to talk about how impactful that was. They still have those cards. And so I think that's one thing around the race conversations, or the sort of hate crime conversations, or whatever it is, and where we're noticing really scary behavior, is what the dialogic classroom does is open up the space where we can start having a conversation about agency, where people might otherwise feel really, really helpless.
Thanks. That's really helpful. You know, one of the things you and I talked about, I know, in preparation for the symposium, was some of the differences potentially between a religious studies class and a class in a law school. But I think it could be helpful for those who are listening to this to know that at least one of the classes that you talked about is a required class is a religious studies class. So it's not all electives. It's not all students who have just decided this is the sort of classroom they want to be in.
No, and that's just to make a point, that's almost every class I teach. Our department serves our undergraduate curriculum here at SMU, and so most students are not in my classes because they have a deep-seated love of religious studies. It was fulfilling a university perspective, and it fit in their schedule.
So here's now, so I let you know that I wanted to ask a question that was outside the classroom too, and that's what this one is. So the focus of the symposium was on ADR's place in a polarized era. And we've talked so far in this conversation largely about conversation occurring within the classroom. And I guess the question is, do you think that, how does this work outside the classroom? I mean, part of the reason the students have been able to engage in the conversations they've been able to engage in is because of the way you structured the class. What are you thinking? I'm not even gonna say hope. What are you thinking that they are able to take away from their experience in the class that might translate into not just conversations with their family around the Thanksgiving dinner table, although that's important. I mean, don't get me wrong, that's hugely important. But you know, even going a step beyond that, you know, when they're in conversation with people in their neighborhood, not necessarily family members, or in their church or in the workplace, those sorts of other settings where dialogue matters too.
So what my students tell me is that they're able to lean into discomfort. That's a direct quote from a student from last year, in a way they were unable to before. And they're finding that useful in everything from those family settings, the Thanksgiving dinner table with polarized relatives, to the workplace, where somebody says the thing and they realize they kind of lean back on the skills that we really work on in dialogic classrooms. And they're able to get curious about whatever's underneath what just happened there. And so they don't just shut down. And they'll talk about asking that curious question about, so could you just explain something? I don't think you meant to trigger me. I don't think you meant to, you know, send me over the edge in whatever way just happened. Could you say more about how it is you came to believe that? Is there a story there? Right? So they check in on that gap between intention and impact, which is something we talk a lot about, and they know they may have just experienced one of those gap moments. So they're checking in to make sure the person actually, you know, meant to do that, because they know that maybe they didn't. And they talk about the usefulness of that with roommates and in workplaces, and especially my students who are in leadership positions in clubs and activities. I have one student who is really articulate about his role in a certain club here at SMU and his ability to sort of stop something bad from happening before it did, because people just started talking over each other. And he's just able to say, he uses a sort of intervention technique, I'm just going to pause you there. let's back up a minute. I think we're losing the thread of, and invite them to start again, which is a pretty mature skill. And he just realized he'd sort of embodied it as the result of being in a couple of these classes. And he had this sort of aha moment around it. And I was hearing a few of them over the spring and summer. We started a COVID cafe. We would just get together once a week, just a handful of my students and I, and we were using these techniques to work our way through pandemic. And they were talking about having that dialogic outlook as they were trying to work their way through masking and not masking and the protests, and trying to get curious about things they didn't understand, which at that point was almost everything about their lives. Right? And then also trying to use some of this stuff as we moved over to Zoom very suddenly in the spring, and they felt like their classes were really difficult. And as they had to move home very suddenly. So I'm hearing this sort of panoply of responses where they are taking the core elements of this process, which are curiosity, this notion there have to be sort of rules for engagement, the idea that they may have to lean into that discomfort instead of running away from it. And what I hear from them is they're able to lean into those core principles in order to then not just disengage with the world around them. And that for me was so hopeful, frankly, and encouraging to hear, especially through that spring and summer when everything was new every day and frankly pretty terrible every day.
So just a quick follow-up to that, and then I think Peter has a question as well. We're signaling by whether we're muting ourselves or unmuting ourselves. Just a quick follow-up. Are you also finding or hoping that students might do some of what you described earlier, like the student who is involved with the student organizations, the being transparent about why he's doing what he's doing, and maybe even scaffolding and talking about whether as an organization or as the board of an organization, they might want to have a conversation about how they're going to have conversations? Are they that kind of what you did in structuring the classroom? Are you finding students are doing some of that as well?
Yes, yeah, we are. And in some places, it's actually institutionalized. At Bridgewater College, they have a dialogue club where they taught students even more than I could do in a classroom. Those students went through a workshop there. And when they had a bias incident on campus, students who were affected didn't immediately go to administration. They actually went to that dialogue club to say, help us work it out. And we are starting to do some work with some of our named scholarship students here. They just did a conversation on race after watching a movie, and they started that whole conversation by saying, this is the reason we're doing this. So I do think they're able, again, you have to explain why you're doing it. You need to say all of this out loud. People are not going to just absorb it. But if you do that, people can replicate it. And we're seeing students replicate it all over.
So let me, this is just kind of a follow-up to these great stories that you have about your students and how they are demonstrating this in their lives, right, outside the classroom. But it seems like, after reading your paper and hearing you talk today, you're doing two things. You're giving them a mindset, right, but you're also giving them a skill set. And it seems to me that a lot of students are really, really good at understanding things on an intellectual level, but sometimes can't really engage it on a skill level. And so I guess if you could just speak to that a little bit, right? You're sending them out into the world, and some of them might understand it intellectually, but might not be able to do it. And so what do you do for those students?
Well, I think their chances are actually pretty good of doing it because you embody what you practice, and we practice this all the time in dialogic classrooms. So they've had some practice. And again, what I'm noticing in the classrooms where it goes really well is it just becomes the culture of the class. So a few years ago, I'd just been introduced to this, and it was another one of those moments when I got on board, when I realized students were speaking in about a 2-minute little piece. They just sort of embodied that 2 minutes on the timer. And then they would just turn around to their classmates and say, so what do you think about that? Which I think is both a mindset and a skill, right? And they had, like it or not, they had just sort of taken it in and were replicating it. And so I talked about this class as a curiosity engine. They were just self-replicating and moving along that way. And that's my hope, is if you get so used to doing it in one setting, you'll just take it with you into that other setting, because it becomes a naturalized way of speaking and listening, or you have it in your head that listening is a value, right? Because one of the comments I've made other places is that we often reward speaking and listening, right? It's in the undergraduate curriculum, you have to have a writing tag and a speaking tag. We give trophies for this stuff. We don't reward listening, and we don't teach people how to do it. But if we practice listening in the space of a classroom, like really practice it, talk about what good listening is. We often do that by asking students to explain about a time when they knew somebody was listening to them, what was happening. How could you replicate that for somebody else? Giving them to think about their own aspirations. If you're your best self, what does that look like? Even if listening is hard. Right? And then practicing it relentlessly for 14 weeks. Because that's long enough to make a habit. If we can just keep practicing, and as a facilitator, I make sure people are practicing that. That's my job as a teacher. So it does shift my job from just manager of information in a room to coach and facilitator. Right? I have to sometimes stop people and remind them of those aspirations that they hold and that we have agreed to as a class. But what I notice amongst students, and it's my graduate students are going out, and I just, we have a bigger community of practice, both my colleagues on this research project and then here on campus, is that it is big enough to be a culture, and people do start practicing, and they kind of bring their friends along. So I am hopeful both about the mindset and the skills, because what dialogic classrooms do is bring those together in a place where they just become naturalized. Or at least more naturalized. I'm not sure it's ever completely natural. I don't want to make that sound like it's some organic thing. It takes a lot of work. It's a lot of scaffolding. But when that scaffolding's in place, that's when the things come together and the sort of magic happens, and you get the curiosity engine. And then people can recreate that environment in other spaces of their lives.
It's interesting. One of the other symposium authors is Jen Reynolds, and the name of her article is talking about abortion, and then parentheses, listening optional, close parentheses. And one of the takeaways from her piece, I think there's an overlap on one of the takeaways, which is you need to know why you are listening. And you know, Jill, as you talk about listening and its purpose, to me, it embodies all the, you know, all the potential of listening, right? It's both content-based and relational. It's about curiosity. It's really trying to develop connection, etc. And one of the things that I think that Jen Reynolds is moving in the direction of is saying, yes, there is that less listening, which is, you know, full-bodied listening, you know, but there also is more limited listening. And that's okay. And you have to decide means as a matter of strategy, as a matter of self-protection, you need to decide what kind of listening you're engaging in, why it is. Does that seem like heresy to you? Or does that seem realistic?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. One thing, listening isn't always the same, right? So there's an exercise we sometimes do called full spectrum listening, where we ask people to listen either to the story or the values under the story or the emotions, pick one, and then report back to the person what you heard. And for a lot of people, that's just revolutionary. It's like, what, I don't have to try and take it all in. I can actually focus. And, yeah, and then we have a conversation about listening where we talk about how you do this all the time, right? Because your brain just can't handle, right? So, you know, I said, when you walk into this room, what are you listening for? Like, well, I'm listening for the things that are going to be on the test, right? Because that's classroom listening, as most of us have been taught to do it, right? And so one thing we have to grapple with before we can even move into these spaces of deeper conversations is to talk about, you know, our purposes here are a little bit different. This isn't going to be on the test. As a matter of fact, you're sworn to confidentiality. So you're going to be listening in a different way. then we have to sort of sell them on it, frankly. Especially on the campus climate that I've got with a lot of business majors. We use something called the Open Mind platform with Jonathan Haidt put it together, and that sells open-mindedness. It is a hardcore business sell on open-mindedness and about why that's good for you. And it does a lot of that work for me. It gives them a vocabulary around open-mindedness as a virtue, as an intellectual value. My students, it's an app, so they sort of level up on the app. It's a little gamified, so it's almost fun. And it seems to convince them that being open-minded, that kind of listening, more than just a narrow content-focused listening, can be strategically useful, especially at the beginning of a relationship, whether that relationship's with a person or an idea, or say the beginning of a research paper. The more broad spectrum you can be, the better off you're going to be at the beginning of something like that. And it's true. And he talks about this in that app, that, down the road, when you're sort of settled in a relationship, then you can narrow it down to something maybe more strategic. So I think we need to be clear that we need all of those things. Life is large. We have different things we need to do. I mean, one way that transfers for me is in research papers. The beginning of the research paper, I want you to be totally open-minded. I want you to be listening to understand. When you write the research paper, you need to persuade me. I don't want you listening to all those other voices that you've thrown out. Like, I don't want them in the paper. So this is a strategic activity and a strategic stance. It is not always appropriate, right? And you need to know about the appropriateness of these skills. Sometimes they are not going to serve you well.
And if I bring that back again to the profession of law, there are times, Peter, I think you'll agree with me as I say this, that there are times as a negotiator, when you're negotiating on behalf of your client, when you're listening, but you're not necessarily listening in order to develop connection. I mean, you are listening in order to figure out where there is strategic weakness, where there is the potential for strategic advantage. Whether there is some interest you can meet that will cost you very little, but will mean a lot to the other side. And all of those are strategic uses of listening. Absolutely. Well, Peter, do you disagree with me?
No, I absolutely agree with you, but here's the irony of it all, I think, right? I mean, part of what I'm trying to tell my students, those who are very interested in the strategic uses of listening, which Nancy just read about, listed off, oftentimes those won't work unless the other side understands that you fully have heard them on that other level, right? So it's like, if you really want to be strategic, then you better master what Jill has just talked about, right? So it's part of your being strategic. And I'm really interested. I didn't know about Jonathan Haidt's open-minded thing, the app. I'm gonna get it and look at it and everything. That just sounds really interesting. And but this kind of tension that we brought up right here at the end about, especially students who take my negotiations class, especially the ones who are interested in going out and conquering the business world, and they think, well, give me all the tricks. I want to know how to get the other side to do what I want. And I don't care about anything that you say. If it doesn't involve persuasion and how to win, I don't want to hear it. And yet, so I'm trying to figure out how to present the material in a way so that they understand at the end, no, they have to understand all of this stuff, or they won't be able to do their tricks.
So I think we're coming to the end here. This has just been a really wonderful conversation. I'm really glad we've been able to have it. And Jill, I want to give you a chance, if there are any last words that you want to share. I want to give you a chance to do that. But I also just want to say thank you so much for being part of the symposium. Thanks so much for writing your article. And I'm so glad that we are part of the same community, both in terms of interest area and geographic area. I'm looking forward to actually being in your presence down the road.
And I want to thank you as well. And I also want to say it was so great reading your paper. I know that we can get a lot out of these conversations, but there is another level if you read the paper. So I just want to encourage people who've watched watch this to read the paper.
One thing we love about that paper is it has data in it. So it has all the numbers from all those students we surveyed. So yes, I will point people to that paper and that project with all of that research data, which I hope underscores everything that I just said. I feel like it's a data-driven project, and we are very proud of the work we did there. And I am just really hopeful about what this can do for so many people in contexts where it just hasn't been before. And that's something I'm so excited about going further. But thank you so much for having me and finding me, even if we haven't managed to be in the same room together. It will happen.
It will happen. Thanks very much, Jill.
Thank you.